Welcome to another episode of Awaaz in Focus, a part of Azaad Awaaz. Azaad Awaaz is a monthly patrika that focuses on the marginalized sections of the society whose voices are often muted in the cacophony of flashy mainstream media discourse. When referring to marginalization, this platform does not aim to restrict itself to the traditional focus on social aggregates like caste and race alone, but aspires to include a discussion on class, gender identity, environmentalism, representation, and other such things. This month's Patrika aims to focus on the plight of internal migrants in India. In this issue, we would like to understand and document the plight of migrant workers within India through a socio-political and also legal lens and examine their place within the Indian economy, specifically in light of the pandemic. Amongst others, there are two overarching themes that we hope to highlight. This would be urbanization and citizenship. We would like to hence understand existing and emerging law and policy solutions on internal migration by exploring questions of data changing rural-urban relationships as well as housing. Today we have with us Mr. Sandeep Chachra, a social anthropologist by training and a development activist who has lived and worked with indigenous people and Dalit communities in India. He is currently the executive director of ActionAid Association and the co-chair at World Urban Camp UN Habitat. He also volunteers time as the National Advisor on Homelessness and Urban Poverty to the Supreme Court Commissioners of India on the right to food case. Thank you so much for agreeing to do this for us, sir. My first question, for that first bit of this discussion would focus on the migrant labor crisis and the lack of comprehensive national data. Temporary labor migration within India is 7 times greater than permanent migration, according to the National Sample Survey Office. This is specifically true for the working poor and those of castes and scheduled tribes, where temporary migration can be up to 16 times the volume of permanent migration. Do you think that there is a large lack of policy focus on internal migration in India because of the absence of reliable data on migrants in this specific light?
No, thank you, and thank you, and greetings to all, and thank you for having me here. Just a small correction before I begin. I am no longer the advisor to the Supreme Court Commissioners. That case has now merged with another. I now co-chair the World Urban Campaign of the UN Habitat, and am the managing editor for Agri South, a journal on political economy. So just that correction. But just coming to your point that you were raising. So, the issue is more complex. So let me not say because there is no data, there is no policy focus or no, sort of centered focus basis the data. In fact, it could be the other way around. So let me put it that way. There is actually has never been a good amount of policy focus, and that's not on account of absence of data. It is a well-known fact, and this doesn't go in recent times. This doesn't go back to COVID, when there was a huge sort of debate and discussion on lack of data. It's important to have data, but that's not the reason. The last 30, 40 years, even more, have seen rising tide of migration. So it's nothing recent. And let's also say the problem is a deeper one. If you look at, and you yourself are saying it, if you look at the composition of those who are coming to cities to work, or urban areas or towns to work, are overwhelmingly from those who are also vulnerable in the rural areas. Landless communities, agricultural workers, for instance, landless agricultural workers, comprised largely of communities which have been historically marginalized and oppressed, be it the Dalits, the scheduled caste, the tribes, other backward caste groups, groups which are nomadic pastoralists and denotified tribes, for instance, communities which have remained on the fringes in terms of welfare benefits to them. So in some ways, if you look at the composition of who comprises the informal workers or the migrants in the cities, they're the very same people who are also precariously placed in the rural areas. So that's unchanged virtually. It is true that once they are in the cities, there are better opportunities, incrementally better opportunities. Let me not say so it almost sounds like a great transformation. It is not. There might be some income, sort of augmentations, some escape from the bondage of social relations, discriminatory social relations such as caste. But that's about all. So it's the same group of people who, whether they are in cities or whether they are in the countryside, they are suffering those precarities, and huge precarities at that. The degree of precarity might vary a little bit towards betterment in the cities, given the kind of economic growth in the process of urbanization. So that's something I'd like to say. And let me also say that I was putting some data for you. Just let's go back to some data. If you look at the 2011 census, the census reported something like 14.4 crore agricultural workers. On the floor of the parliament at Rajya Sabha in 2016, the then Minister of Labour had talked about 14.7 crore people who are agricultural landless workers, landless agricultural workers. You may add, we are in 2021, we await the census returns. We also know for a fact by these trends that roughly 100 farmers, and obviously small and marginal farmers, lose land per day, per hour, not even per day, per hour. And so therefore this number would have increased hugely. There have been other issues, neglect of agriculture, agrarian crisis, as we all know. We know that there has been reducing state support to agriculture. We also know that there have been other climate-induced, sort of pushes, and you have a growing burden, a growing population of displaced, climate displaced. Some call it climate refugees. Certainly, displacement are very high. In fact, and India is not sort of out of those. If you look at global data, the United Nations High Commission of Refugees, UNHCR, talks of something like 10% of the global population move, and that includes stateless people, that includes refugees, trans-country refugees and inter-country refugees, but that also includes a large range of internally displaced people and a growing proportion of climate refugees. So in many instances, if you are sort of looking at this question whether absence of data is the cause for lack of a policy focus, okay, that's there, but it's a well-known phenomenon. So it's very well known that rural areas are suffering growing precarities. So not only are they agricultural workers, to the numbers that I mentioned, 82% of Indian farmers are either small or marginal. And with the kind of returns in agriculture, with the kind of neglect of agriculture, if I may say, with the kind of models of agriculture we've adopted, it is only natural that people will lose or will suffer dents into their livelihoods. And in such a case, those precarities will drive them anywhere. And it's not just rural urban, it can drive them to another rural area, the inter-district migration. It can drive them to big kilns, for instance, into more difficult work conditions, or what is called quasi-bonded work conditions. It can drive them to contract labor in rural areas. So it will drive them. And this is nothing that you have to really have data to discover. But yes, to the extent you mentioned, data does help. It does help systematize specific policies. And it's not that we haven't had those policies. So if you look at 1979, there was the Interstate Migrant Workmen's Act. So, I mean, leave aside the fact of workmen, because it completely ignores the idea that, the women also move. And it's probably based on that archaic understanding of who's the farmer and who's the worker. And to some degree, it's true, because work participation rates have never been high in India, and even have fallen further. So over this last 2 decades, more specifically. So I'll give it a pause, but you want to follow it up with something?
So based on what you're saying, so when you talk about how policies, it helps in systemization of policy when we have reliable data, isn't it important to understand that there is that largely migrant workers are mostly temporary, their movement to urban spaces are largely temporary. So that could kind of be the reason why there is no reliable data. And to incorporate any kind of policy changes that would make an impact on these temporary migrant workers, there would be some necessity for specific data in that sense, right?
For sure,
Um,
for sure. I mean, so go ahead. Sorry. So you
no,
asked
so
me.
just like continuation of like Trisha's question. Something that we were also looking at was like ActionAid is also involved in like signing up migrant workers for the eShram platform. And something like eShram is about, it is like some people are saying that it is plainly about creating a national database for migrant workers. And but the question then arises, again, going back to the temporariness aspect of it, the question that arises is that does something like eShram, for instance, like ensure universal access? Because I think the universal part of it is missing. And does it ensure the portability of rights? So just, yeah.
See, there's two parts to it. And yeah, let me just begin with the fact that the last couple of years, in COVID times, and I'll come to eShram, and how do you sort of look at eShram. But if you look at the last 2 years, 2.5 years by now, what did we see? We saw that large numbers going into lakhs left cities for their rural areas, for their homes. And that, in a sense, busts the fact that the precarities in the urban areas had really reduced hugely, because they preferred the vulnerability of their homes, which they had escaped from or have come from at this time, to the vulnerabilities of the cities that they were living in. Rental is one issue, and there are many other issues there. But coming back to your question on this temporary nature of migration, true, there is a growing phenomenon, and we have to discover why. The point is not that there is temporary nature or circular migration, as we call it, but the question is really to ask, why is circular migration happening? And what is the reason behind circular migration? When vulnerabilities, if vulnerabilities in cities were hugely reduced, if people had houses in cities, if people had rent subsidized housing in cities or free housing in cities, if people had a life of dignity in cities, if cities were better planned, were more resilient, if people were more secure in cities, if people had access to good public health services, those who are migrating in cities, then obviously the extent of secularity of migration would have come down, because then you would choose to live in a place which offers better stories. So it is very true that circular migration actually reflects the nature of continued precarities, with albeit a bit of difference in both instances, whether it's rural or whether it's urban. That's the first point I want to make. Now, with reference to your second point, would data have helped? Absolutely true on this particular aspect, particularly for concrete planning. You see, eShram is not just a sudden invention. eShram is an outcome of a long demand of social formations, trade unions included, social organizations like ours, so many others, informal workers formations, academics, to create a national database for migrant workers to have more systematic thinking around the issue. While it may not have a reason for absence of policies on migration in the past, it is still an important need to make better, more informed policies for the future. So that's an outcome of that process. Now, your second question, does eShram offer a possibility? Yes, indeed. eShram, and we are sort of engaged countrywide in about more than 150 districts to help, facilitate, support, whichever words you want to use it, informal workers register on eShram portals. Now, is it a good thing? Yes, it is, to begin with. The point is, if nothing else, and I'll come to the other question of nothing else, it offers a creation of a database which in future can serve as an instrument, both at the policy level but also an instrument in the hands of informal workers themselves. कि हमारे पास जी कार्ड है, आपने हमारे लिए क्या किया? What have you done for us? So it serves an instrument to negotiate a better space, to negotiate better entitlements, and to open doors for the possibility of a dignified social security. So it is true in that sense, but it's just the first step. So what do we have in eShram for now, except for accident insurance? We have no other promise at this moment. Of course, there's a vague thing. There is an announcement that there would be some sort of a social security. But if you look at the social security code, the quantum of social security, which kind of social security for what aspect would be given is not defined. So you have a promise minus at this moment of the tangibilities. So in that sense, it may be a good beginning, but a beginning which awaits full birth. What kind of security it will offer, what kind of protection will this act of registration on the eShram portal offer? Of course, there are gaps, and what I'm happy about is that the Labour Ministry is pretty openly looking at those gaps. For instance, we made the suggestion the other day at an NHRC meeting to where Labour Secretary was present, but also some webinars where Director General Labour was there of the Government of India, central government, and suggestions such as look at ease of registration processes, suggestions such as can refugees register on eShram portal, suggestions such as can bonded labor categories, I mean, it's not easy for them to register, but could they register as people in bondage or just had been released from bondage in eShram category? So those are helpful, and they kind of open to it. So those are helpful sort of possibilities to make to the extent inclusion is concerned. Now, to the extent what would be therefore given is still remains an open question. What the welfare state would do by the way of protection, by the way of entitlements, by the way of rights to the informal workers of India, it remains an open question. Of course, the government of India says there are upwards of around 38 crore workers. We feel that there are much higher numbers, somewhere around 50 crores. But this we will discover. And eShram will not discover this because there are still challenges it will never be 100% registration. So while efforts are on, social organization efforts are on, Government of India efforts are on, facilitation centers are on, I don't think it will ever in the quick run be 100% registration, meaning all informal workers of India in a block register under the eShram portal with all the diversities that we have, with all the lack of information that we still have. Of course, campaigns do help, but there is an issue there as well. Yeah.
Well, so I mean, although we have somewhat touched upon this, but but I still think the next question is important in the sense that, so this goes back to the, the paper that you wrote in back in 1993 about the changing nature of policies regarding rural-urban migration. And something that you've quite clearly said there is that there is a shift in the way in which the state is approaching this question. And you seem to then suggest that the reason why this is happening is because the state is just unable to control and plan for this ever-increasing population, and hence it then pivoted towards policies to discourage this kind of migration. But cities have still grown since then. So the question is that is there actually does this still continue? It's been 3 decades since then, but does this kind of an approach still continue? And this, yeah.
Okay. You see, 1993 was a different century anyway. Having said that, I wrote this paper when the current phase of liberalization was just about beginning. 1993, so you can imagine, yeah, when the kind of privatization that we saw subsequently, the kind of globalization and liberalization, with all its positives and its negatives, was just about beginning. What was called opening up in those times. I also wrote this paper, particularly when you talk about town and countryside or rural and urban in that time. Uh, well, let me put it honestly, I was more hopeful of land reforms. Yeah. One was, I won't say really hopeful, because it had then also been, almost 45, 50 years into liberation and independence. The idea of land reforms, the talk on land reforms, uh, the push towards land reforms had already almost waned post 80s, or even in the 70s, in the end part of 70s. But even then, as you compare today, 30 years later, where it's become a completely silent, untalked of, unfinished, and kind of a silent question. So it was still a possibility. And I'll come back to the question of land. So that was a time when this discussion was. But now, if you say, has the state given up since then, referring to the question you were asking, I think there's almost a deja vu scenario. Yes, the state almost seems to have thought that it's the deja vu, it's the way things would go. So whether or not you call it giving up, but it has just let it be. So even back then we were asking for a database, or the centralized database on migration, if you've seen that, but nothing happened in those 30 years. So one can only say that it has given up. Now, had it not given up, at least minimally you could have thought of safe migration. Yeah. You could have thought of some kind of urban basic services, some kind of housing facilities, temporary or otherwise. It took a lot of time for us. I was part of the petition which was filed in the Honorable Supreme Court back in 2002 for shelters for urban homeless people. And I was part of the team which did sort of assessment of cold wave deaths back in 2002-3 in order to make the petition, yeah, of homeless people who essentially were migrants and who essentially were urban informal workers. Among them, a small category who were old and destituted, but a large category of people who were actually city makers, as we call them subsequently, or homeless, then in the petition. So it took a lot of time. It was only in 2012 that the national scheme of shelters for urban homeless came about. So, at least that, and that's not a huge number. People who are living on the streets, who were workers and city makers and were living on the street, it took so long to even make that scheme of urban shelters, what is called night shelters, and now 24/7 shelters. So it's obvious that there hadn't been the kind of seriousness in thinking with reference to rural-urban migration. Let me take another point. If you look at the city side itself, this is what was argued back then. That at least there could have been planning of cities in the master plan of various cities, a central thought given to the fact that, there is growth in cities, and therefore that needs to be planned for. Whether it's workers' housing, whether it's social housing, whether it's to do with the basic water and sanitation facilities, whether it's to do with resilience of cities and planning for resilience of cities. You saw much later the kind of floods and the kind of havoc it reaped on more informal workers and the city makers in Chennai, in Srinagar, in so many cities after that. But it was written up there, right? That you hadn't done the land reforms. You had precarious or very uneven distribution of land in the rural areas. You had people who were in highly precarious conditions, without land, with very small land and marginal land holdings, with neglect of agriculture sort of beginning to happen. And therefore, people would find a life and livelihood. It's a compulsion. And in that paper, you will see the argument that it's not the bright lights effect. So, often the argument in the 80s and 90s used to be that, city lights are bright, so people come to bright lights, quote unquote. Yeah, it wasn't. It was a compulsion. Yeah. And in that sense, it's quite clear that things had been done. Of course, some steps have been taken. So let's also not, the fact remains that more recently, the government of India in 2014-15 came up with the idea of what they called rurban, rural urban. Yeah, but the idea has stayed in its sort of abstraction. So one hasn't seen what urban has meant beyond the jargon, or beyond a good idea. Actually, one hasn't really seen how it implements in on the ground. Beyond internet facilities in rural areas, or beyond some other technological facilities in rural areas. But in the very basic instance, it needs to touch on the structural questions, land being one of them, rural housing being another one of them, through the Pradhan Mantri Awas Yojana. There are many more needed, but also importantly, the caste question, the social hierarchy question, the question of discrimination in rural areas needs to be at the center of this thinking on rural urban. Yeah.
I think that makes a lot of sense. So while we were doing our research as well, we were thinking of this whole pattern of rural urban with the advent of like liberalization, globalization, urbanization after the 90s. There of course there were many changes in socioeconomic there were many socioeconomic changes which led to a change in migration patterns as well. So, in that sense, we were kind of trying to analyze what is the appeal of the urban. So, the dogma that India lives in its villages has hindered significant academic and practical research into issues surrounding the complex rural urban relationship. So, it has resulted in an intellectual environment in which rural is entirely associated with a village economy based on agriculture and a caste-based social structure. And the collective imagination of a rural Indian is a male farmer. So do you believe that multiple facts are ignored by such a oversimplistic and seemingly straight rural-urban interaction? And how important is it to reorient our intellectual response to the urban movement in India in order to formulate better and more effective policies? Um, and what can we gain by moving beyond the disciplinary boundaries of agrarian and urban? And what specifically has the pandemic taught us in this regard?
See, I mean, we must, I completely agree with you that we must escape the prisons of history and the prisons of the past. And in this instance as well. Let me step back a bit. Now, where does this come from? A rural urban, but more importantly, comes from, in a sense, there's history to it. Yeah. In one part, at least, in the part that we are currently sort of looking at. And what is that history? It's the history of the North. So yes, 2 centuries ago, around 2 centuries ago, or more than 2 centuries ago, depending which part, we did see shift of agrarian populations into non-agrarian futures. Now, for that, for the moment, I'm using non-agrarian in that historical context as industrialization or massive industrialization, what was called the Industrial Revolution, which was concentrated in particular arenas, more like the urban, right? Which becomes the urban. So I'm using it for that for the moment. So that is a historical fact. But the other important fact is that it could only occur in history at that particular point in time for various reasons. You see that when the northern countries in particular, let's say Europe, or let's say UK, for instance, or Germany, for instance, and so many others, when they rapidly reduced populations dependent on agriculture from 60, 70, 75%, down to, in these 2 centuries, down to 3, 4, 5, 6%. That's the populations in these countries which are sort of connected or dependent on agriculture. Those were under particular historical circumstances. And what were those? That was one, massive industrialization, which is called manufacturing or labor-intensive industrialization in that era. But how was it sort of possible to do it? It was possible to do it because of what is called the engine of colonialism and accumulation of wealth or stealth of wealth through the process of colonization. So you could generate tremendous surpluses, which you could siphon off or steal off, and actually invest into development of massive industries, industrial complexes, with the technological innovations possible due to a huge amount of capital accumulation. So that was one, yeah, that you had colonies to accumulate all this wealth from. Secondly, you could also, because of the sort of control of colonies, you could transfer populations massively, or what is called export populations. So UK exported populations to Australia, to settler colonies in Africa. The other parts of Europe exported massive population, also to Americas, yeah, which meant annihilation of whole range of people in those continents, whether in Australia or whether in the US or Northern America. But also a lot of other European countries exported populations into the South of Americas. Take Portugal into Brazil, take Spain into a large part of what's called South of Americas, take Germany into Southern Africa, so on and so forth. So under colonization, these two things concurred: export of populations. Irish famine, for instance, how many people went to the US? You would probably know the numbers, or you probably research the numbers. Huge number of people were transferred. And labor intensive manufacturing industrialization, which could absorb what is called freed serfs. There's the serf, the serf question. The feudal serfs were free men due to the passage of particular acts in the UK, and there therefore could be free labor which could be absorbed in the industries. And therefore, you could reduce over these 1.5 to 2 centuries populations dependent on agriculture into transfer them into other non-agricultural pursuit, service in manufacturing industries, service industries, and others, and achieve the kind of rural-urban transformation that, or agrarian, non-agrarian transformation that we are talking of, what is called labor transformations. This cannot be repeated for many simple reasons. Now, 2 centuries, 2.5 centuries later, say for example in India, can we repeat that? Is it possible to do so? Is industrialization any more labor intensive? Is it possible to export populations who are on agriculture the way it happened 2.5 centuries ago? Not only are these historical impossibilities, these are also ecological dead ends, and they're not desirable. So what did this transformation, quote unquote, do? It therefore created a huge climate footprint. It therefore created a huge climate disaster possibilities for future and for the global south. So do we want to do that? So if we can't do that, and we shouldn't be doing that, in such a scenario, you will see the idea actually change to the idea of what therefore is the countryside. We're not sort of in the macroeconomic planning, in the macro thinking, in the macro policy planning. This should be a central fact. That therefore means you have to regenerate rural economies. You have to revive rural economies, agriculture and allied activities, and others. So in some ways, you have to look at multiple pathways, land reforms being one of them, sustainable agriculture being one of them, climate resilient sustainable agriculture being one of them, rejuvenation of cooperatives or solidarity economy being one of them, levels of development of rural infrastructure being one of them, rural markets, rural industrialization. So one can go on and on. So you have to do that. On the other hand, you have to make your cities more livable, cities more inclusive, cities for all, but also it's not just merely the geography of it or the space of it. You have to make the urban life far more progressive, decent, and inclusive, which means urban employment, which means removal of all types of precarities, what I was talking of, because you can't reverse history. A lot of people have come to cities. India has urbanized a lot in these years. So one has to take multiple pathways in both the town and the countryside. And that therefore calls, going back to your question, not splintered ideas of discipline. Here's rural and here's urban. So you have to talk of in a much more connected, committed way. The boundaries between these two disciplines, the question you're asking, therefore need to be obfuscated into more what is called futuristic planning of what should your transformation look like. Of course, it's important to have some specifics, but those boundary questions need to be diffused a lot more than they are. The rural-urban continuum, as has been argued over ages, needs much more interdisciplinary or sort of integrated work, if I'm making myself clear.
Yeah, and that makes sense, sir. So, but I think one question I have is when you're talking about urban employment, um, what is the appeal of the urban? Why would so it's not limited to landless farmers or people from lower socioeconomic backgrounds in rural spaces, right? So we have some people in rural settings yearning for urban employment. So what I try
Why
to
is it?
understand
Why
is
is it?
why is the why what
You
is
see,
the
this is I mean, this is basic, no? And I think it's important question. Hima, and what is it? Why do people, even from, let's say, relatively better off rural sections, go to cities? Uh, I think there's a whole range of things. Uh, this is the question associated with public services and developmental investments. You have education facilities in urban areas which are far. The question is, why do people who are not, let me put it, completely driven out from the huge precarities in the countryside, then choose also to go to urban in many instances? And that's a factor of what kind of services you have in the urban spheres. Aside from the fact that it might lead to more opportunities, because somehow, as you know, and as UN Habitat says, and we all know that growth is complete concentrated in the urban centers of this world. Yeah, it's an urban growth. In fact, urban contributes more than 70% of the GDPs if you take it globally, yeah, of the global economy. So in some ways, an Indian economy also, urban has a disproportionately growing and higher sort of contribution. So it's quite obvious that growth is concentrated in urban areas, and therefore the level of development of public services, the level of development of infrastructure, for instance, the level of development, therefore, of opportunities, be it linked to education, be it linked to health, be it linked to sort of quality of life in some ways, transport is much higher. So that's another important factor, and that is, many would argue, that's on account of neglect. So you kind of, and therefore and therefore huge concentrations of everything in the urban, including economic concentrations, and that's another factor which will bring people to the urban. But that is untenable in centuries to go head on, for the reasons we were arguing. Because how do you sort of create, you have, let me put it simply, you have 500 million informal workers in India, or there around 50 crore informal workers in India, about a third of our population, or more than a third of our population is into informal economy. And the conditions of informal discussion of it, whether in rural or whether in urban, are precarious, only different by a small degree, which therefore means you today have 50 crore people who are transacting cities, who are transacting sort of districts, who are in rural or in urban, or are in circular migration, without much their lives, to the precarity of their lives. Now you have that in urban centers. What are you going to do? Are you creating that many jobs? Can you create that many jobs with dignity? Can you create a social security benefit? Or is it possible to create that kind of a benefit for a dignified future? For 50 crore people in India, for instance, or if you take it globally, it's more than 2 billion people, yeah, or roughly about a third of, or a little less than a third of the global population. Is it historically possible to create it? That's what I was arguing. That was done in history, but that was done at a huge cost to many other people of the world. Yeah, huge cost of slavery, huge cost of colonialism, huge cost of extermination of existing populations, or what is called quote unquote, where Europeans were exported. So in some ways, If that's not possible, what are your solutions to create dignified futures, just futures, futures of decency for people who are now coming to the urban? That's the majorities. Yes, there may be a few rich people. Yes, there may be a few middle classes and upper classes who will also come to the cities, because in your mind, the fact is that cities are the engines of growth, which they have become. And you don't become engines of growth just because, just overnight or just by accident. There has huge investment which has gone into cities, which has not gone into the rural areas, and that's the cause of the, so it goes round. So it is also the cause of the agrarian distress. Yeah, if you had been investing in agriculture, if you had been doing land reforms, if you had been pursuing pathways of sustainable, climate resilient, organic agriculture, if you had been doing rural industrialization, if you had been creating cooperative economies and solidarity economies in the rural areas, such a situation, you have to then address it. And that is why, let me also say that is why I also argue for the idea of the right to the city. Now, what is right to the city? Right to the city, and that's a restorative idea as well. Right to the city is not a new concept. Yeah. Right to the city, 1968, some progressive city governments as well, to reclaim the question of the city as a co-created space. Because what's happening in cities, the other aspect that we haven't really talked about is cities are almost like apartheid cities, quote unquote, where you have large populations of what we call city makers, what are essentially the workers and the makers and the informal workers of the city, which constitute roughly about 60, 70, 80% population of cities, living in land masses, it's 20%. Yeah. You're castigated to those land masses, often unsecure, sort of untenable areas, what is called polluted areas, what's called high risk areas. And then you have these large city greens in control of a few upper classes, or in control of the few elite of the cities, with golf courses, with large parks, with greens, with exclusive zones, city zones. And that's not the situation of one city. That's the situation globally of every other cities. And more recently, with this technology, you have these satellite images of many big cities of the world, and you can see the extent of difference. Yeah? You can almost see, especially what is the politics of the cities, and in such a situation, right to the city offers to the protagonists, that means the city makers, the informal workers, the migrants, an opportunity to co-create a city, to claim the city, because they made the city. Yeah? They made all these buildings. In COVID times, it was most evident who is actually serving the city, who is actually cleaning, the frontline workers. Yeah? So that's the other aspect to this argument. So yes, people do come to cities for better opportunities, but the question then arises is, why not better opportunities all across? Why not more economic investments all across? Why not better public services all across? Why not access to healthcare, free public healthcare, quality healthcare, gender responsive healthcare, gender responsive education? Why not everywhere? And therefore, it means a set of thinking, a sort of bold new thinking of how you're sort of going to look at transformation. Because otherwise, if you fall back into what happened in history, you're not going to be able to resolve this question. Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Sorry,
No,
I lost connection momentarily. Yeah, that's okay. Please go ahead.
Yeah. So did you have anything else to add to that? Or should we?
No, I think, you were asking, and I think at some stage you were asking what's changed. I probably didn't touch too much on that. Some things have changed. So let's also not think that no progress has happened. There are fundamentally unresolved issues, which I was talking of, but things have changed in rural areas too. I mean, for one, since the 80s, since I was writing that last bit, and over this time I've written others, a lot more democratization has happened in the rural areas with the 73rd Amendment. So if you really look at it, Gram Sabhas have taken root. Yeah. Of course, the blossoms will come, the flowers will bloom, There's a long way still, but they have taken root. Yeah. So rural democratization, grounded democratization has happened in some ways, and that's a promise. Yeah. It hasn't happened so well. And since we are also talking of cities, it hasn't happened so well in the 74th Amendment, which is in the urban local bodies. And you keep on having this smart city thinking with special purpose vehicles, which overrides the idea of the urban local bodies, and arguments from movements, arguments from activists, those who work with slum dwellers would always be to empower urban local bodies, so that they are under the control of people, but and not to sort of push these special purpose executive vehicles, which are in some ways an antithesis of what progress has been done in urban democratization or efforts towards urban democratization. But in rural areas, some of these things have happened, and you need to empower them more. It's not a complete project. So that's a good sign. Some things haven't changed. The fact remains that we did, and just to give you an example, we did, as ActionAid, we did 2 surveys, national surveys, covering 15 states, and looking at the instance of caste discrimination and untouchability. And I tell you, one in 2002, which was published by SAGE in 2006, and then now in 2017, 16, 17, and now going to be published soon. There's some data issues that we're looking back at, case studies and others. But two things haven't changed. Untouchability remains. Its nature and forms may have changed in terms of the expressions of it. Atrocities remain and have in some instances gone up. And finally, the question of caste-based work, caste-based occupations, as you say, continues.
So you're still breaking up a little bit.
Evident. It's so evident even. Okay.
So you were breaking up. Yeah, you were still breaking up just a little bit. But yeah, I think you spoke about urban local bodies, and I think,
can you hear us, sir?
Give me a moment. Sorry, there's too much problem here today. The internet. If it's clearer. Is it clearer now?
No, sir. I mean, not for me. Trisha?
No, she's frozen.
I can't hear you.
Okay, let me change it again. Otherwise,
it's
just
better now.
It's okay now.
Yeah. Yes, sir. It's working. Yeah.
Okay, I was just saying, in short, I'll say, I was just saying some things have progressed.
Yeah.
The instance of rooting democratization in rural areas through 73rd Amendment, it's gone certainly progress. It's a good sign for future. Urban local bodies need more strength and more progress. Some things remain unchanged, continue, may have become marginally better, but still sort of persist. Caste discrimination, for instance. We've done a couple of more recent studies with reference to, over a span of 15, 16 years, with reference to untouchability. Untouchability remains, its nature, extent, and forms have changed. One in 2002 and one in 2017. Two surveys, national surveys covering about 15 states, a sample of villages in 15 states. Some things, so yeah, caste-based occupations continue. People are pushed into particular occupations on account of historic linkage and caste, scavenging, for instance. So many other occupations, leather flaying, sort of disposal of animal carcasses, dead bodies. We saw all that. So some things need to change in terms of rural social relations. Bonded labor persists, for instance. So the bondage, the question of feudal bondage may have transmutated, and newer forms of bondage have emerged. So some things remain unchanged, changed in the sort of forms, but in terms of hierarchy, in terms of exploitation, continue. So those things need to change. Yeah. So there's continuities which need to be sort of bad continuities which need to be sort of escaped from. The gender relations, for instance, patriarchy, for instance. Yeah. I mean, there's no space, ideally, for patriarchy in the 21st century, but it continues. It continues to have newer ways of newer expressions of the instrument of rape. One may argue that it's more reported, yes. Crimes against women may be argued that more reported, but if you look at the acquittals, if you look at how justice is given now, it leaves a lot to be desired. So I think there is this whole thing, but there is also newer possibilities of doing things. The right to the city, for instance, I was saying, is one of those. Newer imageries of what rural transformations should look like, could look like, are among those. What are the rural-urban continuums? What kind of social security should we offer? What kind of living wage? Article 43 of our Constitution talks of the concept of living wage. So what is this living wage? So when you talk of transformations, whether in rural or urban areas, some of these things have to be really revisited. So 75 years or 73 years now into our independence, we can't be still struggling with the concept, hovering around the idea of minimum wages. And I think these are issues, unless you sort of look at these. So what's really the decent income we're talking about? What's the decent social protection we're talking about? What are the workers' rights we're talking about? Have the hard-earned struggles of workers to gain some semblance of rights in terms of workers' rights, in terms of bargaining rights, in terms of are they there with them, or are they losing it? Are they getting diluted? And I think these things, the new labor codes sort of have issues around it. For instance, the period of strike. So you have to give, in the industrial relations code, you have to give a 14-day notice for when you want to go on strike, and that really dents your ability to, sort of collectively bargain, to collectively protest, to collectively make your cause heard. So there are these issues which, unless you address them, you cannot make those transformations. Take for example the whole concept, which was in the cooperatives, the idea of worker-owned enterprises, worker-owned industries. I mean, it's really few examples here and there, which seem like islands of hope, nothing more. Yeah? We work in tea estates, and a lot of those tea estates get closed because tea probably may not be as remunerative with the global prices. And then you have workers in these tea estates who are in pre-starvation conditions, having no opportunities. So obviously joining the pool of this large wage labor, may find work, may not find work. Now, why not have worker-owned tea estates? Because they're anyway lying there. Look at the question. You're talking of cities and workers. Look at the question of cobblers during lockdown and without lockdown. What kind of a life is there? So I think there are this huge set of issues when we generalize data, when we sort of look at trends, we seem to forget the kinds of continued precarities and sufferings many of these caste-based workers have, or sort of exported workers have, if I may call them, and also the human face of what's sort of unraveling. And it is through this human face, it's through this community, this group, this worker, that you understand, not through data only, that you understand that what is the transformation needed and what is the problem currently in this imagery called the urban and the rural, in this idea that we have cities for all. Now, if you go with the idea of cities for all to a barber or to a shoemaker or a cobbler in a city, probably she or he will look at you and say, well, yeah, I mean, there is the question of two cities. There's this part of this type of city for me, and there's that type of city for the others. So I think that's the point here.
So that does give us like a really good overview of everything. Just the last question that we had, last section that we wanted to cover was on housing, you know, I think we've already you know, hinted at the problems here a little bit. So I make the question short. So one is, to what extent with migrant crisis we saw a housing crisis? Now we're looking at solutions to that problem. Something like the affordable rental housing complexes scheme, or even setting up hostels for workers. So how sustainable are these? I mean, it's not like rental housing wasn't a reality before for migrant workers. It existed in informal ways. So, you know, how sustainable are these policies given everything that we've spoken about so far?
Okay, so how much of the migrant crisis was, first question was, how much of the migrant crisis was housing crisis? I think there's been a lot written on it. To a large extent, it was also a housing crisis. We did two surveys. ActionAid Association India took two surveys, one in May of 2020 and the other in I think September of 2020, when there was a huge migrant outflux, as we all know, with the lockdowns. In both those surveys, these were surveys conducted across about 18 or 17 states, with a sample base of over 15,000 workers, informal workers, not just migrant workers, but informal workers. Many of them obviously migrant, and then a large chunk obviously migrant. And then you realize that roughly about 3/4 of the worker, it was slightly different in two surveys, had lost wages hugely, no wages during the lockdowns obviously, but had lost overall wages, but also livelihoods of whatever they were up to. And therefore, had not the incomes to one of the reasons, apart from the fear, apart from the public health, access to public health services, apart from the isolation, one of the big reasons for them going back home was the inability to keep giving rentals. Not many had reduced rentals. Some kind landlords perhaps had, but mostly not. That's not statistically valid. Had not the possibilities of rentals, and among other things. So it was an important factor in the decision to go home. So the question of housing, therefore, has been, and some specific researches have been done. Refer to those. I'm not able to give data offhand. The housing crisis was a big question. It's not the housing crisis. It's actually the rental crisis. It's the fact that they lacked housing. Yeah, let's put it that way. And therefore, that was one of the important reasons. Now, you come to the second question, and that remains a big issue in urban India, and it's again not new. In terms of, I told you about the process we went through, social organizations to even get shelters for urban homeless. And that's only now realized in many cities and still in pursuit in many others. And that's only a small micro part of the solution to the housing question. And one has been arguing of a housing continuum, where you sort of look at a range of housing solutions. Now, coming to your point on how did the affordable housing rental AHRCs complexes help. First of all, it's too new to comment. Yeah, it's been in application only about 1 year. And at this moment, the idea is good. Let me begin by saying that the need is important. The fact that you need to have rent controls, this is not about rent controls, but the fact that you need to have some kind of rental opportunities for migrant and other workers, affordable rental housing opportunities is a good one. So there's not much debate. It's too early to comment on how it has resolved the issues because they're just about starting. So it's 2021 when this idea has come up. There's some early issues. And among those early issues is the fact that number one, it is more or less a PPP solution, a public-private partnership solution. And in a lot of instances, although it can also be a public solution, it is stroke PPP, private stroke public, yeah, in many instances. But in most instances, these have been given to privates to build up, to maintain, to refurbish, and I think that it will present an issue in terms of its future selection of beneficiaries, for instance, in terms of the role of ULBs. So one would much rather prefer if these were under public control. Secondly, there are some early emerging issues of the locations. I was going through some research, many of these locations are quite unsuitable for workers of the cities, domestic workers, migrant workers, who are concentrated around particular work. It's there for livelihoods. People are there for livelihoods, right? So that really is not really factored in here. So you may have in Vadodara a kind of a housing complex on AHRC under construction available near the airport. And that therefore begs the question of transport facilities and public transport and available secure transport for workers. And so those issues are also emerging. The third set of issues is about the whole point of affordability. Might be more evident later, but rentals around 2,500, 3,000 may not be tenable for a segment of workers who probably are living today in whichever shanties for 1,000 rupees, 1,200 rupees. So there are issues of affordability itself. And I think this whole question of affordability becomes very subjective. And therefore, it's important to go back to the idea also of rent controls. And I think rent controls at particular sort of space related rent controls, ki do kamra hai to itna lagega, usse zyada nahi lagega. And it could be categorized for workers, for informal workers. So I think some creative solutions around rent controls need to be made. So I see that as a possibility. The other bit, when you're talking of sustainable solutions, there's no escape from the idea of land tenures in urban areas. So you must have slum land regularization. There's some interesting campaigns which Mysore Slum Board is taking, for example. Yeah. So you need to make sure that existing, and these promises you'll hear often during election times, including in Delhi ki ab aapka patta milega sabko jo bhi aap UP mein reh rahe hain. So that regularization needs to happen. We must put a moratorium on evictions, and you can't think of rental, you can't and keep pushing people out overnight through sort of very undesirable, completely forceful evictions. And I think that sends a completely wrong message. It's wrong as well ethically. So in some ways, a moratorium on evictions, then no rehabilitation without informed consent. This happened in several cities. In Chennai, for instance, after the floods. Okay, your house is untenable. The place you've been staying near the riverbeds is not good. It is, sort of climate, it's at risk. So we'll send you 40 kilometers off. So obviously, you send people 40 kilometers off in whatever form of housing. And how do people come to work? So they lose their work when you choose not to go. So in some instances, no rehab without informed consent needs to be an underpinning principle, as is a need for a moratorium on evictions. Then, in terms of land tenure regularization, you can have community tenures, particularly in slums, and do rebuilding of slums in more creative ways. And it has been done globally in many instances. You can also think of individual land tenures, homestead land. A policy which is needed nationally is a policy of that as a person, a resident of India, you would have a right to a homestead land. Now, that homestead land needs to be defined, whether it's 10 decimals in rural areas or whether it's more than 10 decimals. This is an important sort of pathway for future, that at least, if not agricultural land, if you're not doing the land reform, at least guarantee that every person of this country has a right to a land, every adult family, let's say, or every adult, I mean, I'm talking of in a familial sense or can be adult sense, have a right to a homestead tenure, whatever that's now defined as, whether it's very small, but obviously dignified enough to build something. And that's possible to do. And that also goes to urban areas. Okay, the argument is you cannot have land rights, every individual cannot have land rights, then you do vertical buildings. Then the norms for verticality also need to be set. You see, the important thing is many workers in cities are here for livelihoods, and their housing needs to be shaped with the kind of livelihoods. For example, अगर मैं सब्जी बेचता हूँ तो मुझे ठेला तो रात को रखना पड़ेगा ना, तो आप मुझे जैसे भी घर दोगे तो वो उसमें जगह होनी चाहिए ठेला रखने के लिए. So it's linked to livelihoods, these solutions. So I want to say that. I also want to say, with reference to what other sustainable solutions are. The other sustainable solution we've talked about at length, which is about reviving rural economies and the countryside itself, which is also, and the other thing that you see is expansion of cities. So planning, city planning, resilient city planning, futuristic city planning becomes an important instrument to resolve many of these issues. This unplanned kind of जो कभी हो गया चला नहीं, यहाँ पानी नहीं मिल रहा है, वहाँ security issue है, safer cities. So these all need to be planned for future. So this unthought through sort of deja vu kind of urbanization is not a sustainable solution as well, apart from these housing issues, apart from livelihood issues, apart from transport issues that I pointed to, climate resilience issues. Yeah? That would mean, and then of course co-creation and co-management of cities, which we talked of.
Increasing employer liability. I feel like
Yes.
One of the other especially when it comes to migrant workers, like temporary migration again. If you increase the liability of employers, then when it comes to housing, then it would be, I think, also a very sustainable.
Okay, yeah. In fact, it is true. In fact, I missed putting that. In fact, yesterday there was a discussion on Rajasthan's urban homeless policy, and many social formations, and I'm part of that as well. We're part of that as well. Are making a new proposal for a policy of housing, urban housing, and homelessness, eradicating homelessness in the state of Rajasthan. It's a proposal. Let's see what the government looks at. An important element of that, we all think it's very important, is the question of employer liability, contractor liability. Yeah. So the employer liability, whether it's DMRC, whether it is somebody else doing a city metro or some other construction happening, you need to give not the shack-based housing. You need to give particular, and setting standards for that housing is important. Because on paper there can be a plastic tin or a plastic roof put or a tin put, and you call that a house. Yeah. I think some standards of and liabilities for employers for housing, use of construction workers' welfare funds and social other kind of welfare funds for housing. So there are many such things that have to happen to ensure a right to housing. The question is, it is important. I am talking both contexts. It is important to install a right to housing in our future sort of progressions. And I think in that regard, and I'm going to end here. In that regard, you see, the issue for the one of the big solutions for ensuring ensuring advance of dignity, ensuring advance of security of some kind is housing. Among we talked a lot about the wage conditions, the security conditions, the sort of protection issues, but housing is a big one. People spend a lot of money on housing, especially in urban areas.
Well, so thank you so much for joining us today. I think you've told us so many things, and you've I think really highlighted the future of looking at the future of the questions that we need to be asking when it comes to rural-urban migration, and also why we need to be taking ideas like right to the city and right to housing a lot more seriously. So thank you so much for joining us, and thank you.
Thank you. Thank you to both of you. Very nice talking with you. And if there's anything more in data or in writing, happy to share it with you. And all the best.
Thank you so
Reach
much.
out. Good wishes for your endeavors.
Thank you so much.